Before we get to Ken, I'm unclear, Barbara, who, and I've heard talk from the neighborhood group that, somehow we would have more beds. Does anyone know where this came from? In other
They
words,
said it came from the consultants, that's all I heard.
Wendy?
Originally what happened is when the master facilities planning was updated just prior to this EIS process getting started, they looked at data that we were able to give them from the jail growth. Now, part of the things that skewed that data somewhat is between 2006 and 2007, there was an enormous increase in the jail population when the new work center came on board. And so what happened was the consultants had hired to do all the mathematicals plugged this into what is a standard regression curve, which is a mathematical formula to figure out growth factors. And they plugged it in, and that came up with, well, we're going to need this number of beds by here, and we think based on this growth formula, we're going to need it by here. We're going to need the 2,400 beds by 2050. So they're talking a 50-year growth pattern. Well, now what's happened is that was done in 2008. Now we're at 2011, so we've got more years of data, and what I'm getting from plugging the numbers in that same kind of a standard regression formula is that it's growing at a smoother and slower rate than we anticipated. So we're probably not going to need quite as many beds. But the other issue that we run into, and you can see that in the history of jail population growth in this county, is it'll go along and then you get these peaks and it resets. And in this,
we increase capacity, it's
well, that was the last reason, but in years past it's been because the DUI law changed, the suspended driving law changed, the domestic violence law changed, Sentencing Reform Act happened, which shoved back people that were going into the state prison system back to county jails. We are by our nature a reactive entity, that once the laws are passed, we're stuck with dealing with the fallout. So that's one of the things that I think the consultants were trying to build in, is to make sure that the land space was large enough that if we start seeing these ships coming on the horizon, that we can see this population is growing at a faster level or a slower one, we can adapt to that. One of the things I've been doing is I've been looking for information to help respond to the EIS response, is looking at what other counties have done. And one of the things you saw, Spokane is one that's within the state of Washington that's gone through a very similar process. And for them, one of the things they were looking at is high-rise jail versus vertical jail. Horizontal, thank you. I always get those mixed up. Horizontal jail, they were talking about one of the reasons they strongly advocated for horizontal jails, it gave them much more flexibility, that they didn't have to overbuild the entire facility at the beginning. They had to overbuild parts of it because of the way jails are run. But the housing units, which oftentimes are some of the most expensive, you don't. You only build what you need for now and say the 5 years out. Then if you need to stick on another housing unit, you can always do that. If you don't need it, you don't need it.
Is that sort of the pod concept?
Yeah, and that's really one of the things, that's what, as part of this whole EIS, looking at different sites, has been an issue we've addressed and looked at, and that was looking for enough land so we can go out. You keep them a story or two, and you move out, and then you add on the amount of living space you need at the time that you need it, or within that short-term planning horizon. It's always, the analogy I used when I was talking to some folks is it's kind of like the long-range weather forecast versus the short-range weather forecast. We asked the consultants to tell us today if on August 25th the weather's going to be nice enough for a wedding. Well, they can tell you, well, based on general trends, and we kind of think it usually is that way in the month of August, and so, yeah, sort of kind of this is the answer. Now, if you want to know if by the end of the week it's going to be okay or not, they can tell you that pretty clearly. So we can tell you jail population reasonably within a year or two. 50 years out, which is what we had asked the consultants to originally do as far as population estimates, is really like asking Jeff Renner on Channel 5 if August 25th is going to be an okay day to have an outside wedding. He can give you general trends, but nailing it down specifically, there's no way you can tell until you get closer.
But this was enormous.
It was, but it was, again, it was based on, basically, was it Ken, you were saying that you liked the mathematical formulas with numbers. That's exactly what they did. And when I plugged them in at that same time, I came up with pretty much the same thing. Now that we've got another few years of data that are showing that rate, although still growing, is growing at a much slower rate and a much smoother level than what we had anticipated, it's starting to work itself out. So it may have been in the long run a very good thing that it's taken us this long to get here. They're going to have to update the size and the architecture and the planning as part of the pre-planning. So this whole needs assessment is going to be updated. Then we'll have even, somebody who's got different initials behind their name than mine to look at that and plug those in and say yes or no. But 590 to 600 is probably not a bad guess as far as opening it up. That may need to go up another 100 or two, but that's part of the discussion that I suspect y'all and the county administrator and us and whomever else are going to continue to have. Long answer to a short question, I'm
Wendy, a
sorry.
question.